It was a cold December dawn when Professor Marcus Whitfield received a call that would change his life forever. On the other side of the line, a trembling voice of a Benedictine monk. "Professor, we found something at the monastery that you need to see, but I fear the consequences." 3 days later, Marcus was in the Swiss mountains, in a monastery built in the 12th century. The monk, Brother Andreas, led him through dark corridors until they reached a secret library carved into the rock. There, on a centuries-old oak table, lay a parchment that would make any biblical archaeologist lose sleep. "This manuscript was found sealed inside a wall during renovations," whispered Andreas, his hands trembling as he held a magnifying glass. "It contains marginal notes from 4th century scribes. They marked specific Bible passages with a strange symbol, an inverted cross with 3 dots. Marcus leaned over the document. What he saw left him speechless. There were 11 biblical verses, each circled in red ink, with annotations in Latin saying, "Silentium Ecclesiae," silence of the church. For 2 years, Marcus kept this discovery secret, translating each annotation, researching each historical reference. What he discovered was disturbing. These 11 verses contained truths so impactful about human nature, about God, and about the church itself, that they were systematically omitted from popular biblical studies for over 1,000 years. Today, for the first time, these truths will be revealed. But I warn you, after knowing these verses, your faith will never be the same. You'll never look at a pulpit the same way, and perhaps you'll never see God with the same eyes. Did you know there are passages in the Bible that the church itself prefers you never discover? Verses so disturbing, so revolutionary, so dangerous to the religious status quo that they were buried under layers of tradition and omission. Right now, as you watch this video, millions of Christians around the world are being kept in ignorance about biblical truths that could completely transform their understanding. What you're about to discover was hidden for centuries, and if you have the courage to question everything you were taught about the Bible, then keep watching, because after the next 40 minutes, there's no going back. The first verse Professor Marcus found, marked in that ancient parchment, was in Ezekiel, chapter 23, verse 20. When he read the original Hebrew words, his face went pale, and she lusted after their lovers, whose members were like those of donkeys, and whose issue was like that of horses. Imagine for a moment the scene. You're in a Sunday school, surrounded by curious-eyed children. When one asks you to read that interesting part from Ezekiel 23, the silence that would follow would be deafening. This verse, hidden in the middle of the book of Ezekiel, contains language so explicitly sexual that most modern translations try to soften its impact. But in the original Hebrew text, the words leave no room for interpretation. God is using an extremely graphic sexual metaphor. What the church doesn't want you to know is that God has no shame in using crude, visceral, shocking language to convey his message. He is not the gentle grandfather of Sunday sermons. He is a God who feels jealousy with the intensity of a betrayed husband, who uses the strongest possible words to make us understand the gravity of our rebellion. Why was this hidden? Because it challenges the sanitized image of God that the church built, because it reveals a God who feels, who suffers, who becomes enraged with human passions, amplified to infinity. The second verse found in the manuscript was in Deuteronomy 25, verses 11 and 12. "When men fight with one another and the wife of one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him and puts out her hand and seizes him by his private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity." This is probably one of the most specific and bizarre verses in the entire Bible. Mosaic law, in its meticulous attention to the details of daily life, legislated on a scenario so specific it seems straight out of a comedy. A woman who, trying to help her husband in a fight, grabs the opponent's private parts. The punishment? Amputation of the hand without mercy. But here's what the church doesn't want to discuss. This law reveals something profound about the Old Testament mentality. Every act had proportional consequences. Male dignity was considered so sacred that violating this dignity, even in a situation of legitimate defense, resulted in severe corporal punishment. What does this tell us about God? That he cares about the most intimate details of human experience, that nothing is too trivial for his attention, that divine justice operates at levels our modern mentality considers extreme. The third verse that made Professor Marcus question everything he knew about the Bible was in 2 Kings, chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. He went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head." And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. This is the story that makes parents tremble when their children bully. Elisha, God's prophet, being mocked by children because of his baldness. His response? A curse that results in the brutal death of 42 children by 2 furious bears. The modern church is extremely uncomfortable with this passage. How to explain a God who kills children for mockery? But here's the truth they don't want you to understand. In the biblical context, mocking a prophet wasn't childish bullying, it was blasphemy. These children, actually young adults, were publicly rejecting the divine authority represented by Elisha. What does this reveal? That God takes his honor seriously, that there are terrible consequences for those who openly challenge his authority, that the God of the Bible is not the understanding friend many preachers paint. He is a God who must be feared. The fourth verse of the parchment led Marcus to an even more disturbing discovery. In Judges chapter 1, verses 4 to 7. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. This passage reveals a brutal practice, cutting off the thumbs and big toes of defeated kings, transforming them into helpless beggars who crawled under tables begging for food scraps. Adoni-Bezek, Canaanite king, had done this to 70 kings. When captured, he himself suffered the same fate and recognized he was receiving divine justice. What does the church hide here? The reality of God's poetic justice, the idea that God uses our own methods against us, that there is a cosmic law of cause and consequence that operates independently of our modern understanding of mercy. This verse reveals a God who allows us to reap exactly what we sow, even if brutal, even if terrible. It's the law of retaliation in its purest form, eye for eye, thumb for thumb. The fifth verse found in the manuscript was in Leviticus chapter 15, verses 19 to 24. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge of blood from her body, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. This is the verse that makes feminists abandon the church and pastors quickly change the subject. The law of menstrual impurity, where a woman in her period was considered ceremonially unclean, contaminating everything and everyone she touched. For 7 days, she was a pariah, isolated, untouchable. The modern church tries to explain this as hygiene issues or cultural context, but is missing the fundamental point. God was teaching about the reality of sin through physical symbols. The menstrual flow represented fallen humanity's nature, something that flows continuously from within us, reminding us of our fallen condition. The impurity wasn't physical, it was spiritual. The separation wasn't discrimination, it was education. What does this reveal about God? That he uses even the most intimate aspects of female biology to teach profound spiritual truths. That nothing in our human experience is outside the limits of his divine pedagogy. The 6th verse of the parchment revealed something about David that the church prefers to forget. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 22. So may God do to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. This is one of the most creative curses in the Bible. David, furious with Nabal, swears by God that he will kill everyone who urinates against a wall, a colorful Hebrew way of saying every man. Why does the church avoid this passage? Because it shows David, the man after God's own heart, making genocidal threats in vulgar language. Because it reveals that even biblical heroes had explosive tempers and used expressions that would make a grandmother blush. But here's the hidden lesson. God doesn't choose perfect people. He chooses real people with real flaws who express anger in real ways. What makes David special isn't his perfection, but his ability to repent when he realizes he's wrong. The 7th verse almost made Marcus abandon his research. It was in Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 12 to 15. And you shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. And the Lord said, Thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread unclean among the nations where I will drive them. God orders the prophet Ezekiel to cook his food over human feces as a prophetic sign. When Ezekiel protests because of the impurity, God allows him to use cow dung. This is the most nauseating prophecy in the Bible, and the church pretends it doesn't exist. Why would God do this? To show how repugnant Israel's sin had become in his eyes. To use an image so viscerally disturbing that it would never be forgotten. To demonstrate that sometimes spiritual truth can only be communicated through physical shock. What does this reveal? That God is willing to use any method, even the most repugnant, to make us understand the reality of our spiritual condition. The 8th verse of the manuscript contained the most graphic description of violence Marcus had ever encountered in the Bible, in Judges chapter 3, verses 21 and 22. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade. For he did not pull the sword out of his belly. This is the most graphic description of a murder in the entire Bible. Ehud, judge of Israel, kills the Moabite king Eglon with details so vivid they seem straight out of a horror movie. The sword disappears completely in the obese king's fat. The intestines empty. The smell must have been unbearable. Why did God include these nauseating details? To show that he is not disgusted by the brutal reality of human existence. To demonstrate that even the most violent acts can be part of his purposes. To reveal that deliverance sometimes comes through methods our modern sensibility considers unacceptable. The 9th verse almost made Marcus lose his faith completely. It was in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 28 and 29. And the king said to her, What is your trouble? And she answered, This woman said to me, Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and ate him. During the siege of Samaria, 2 women make an agreement, eat one son today, the other tomorrow. After eating the first, the second woman hides her son. This is the most disturbing verse in the Bible. Maternal cannibalism, the most basic instinct of motherhood transformed into its most terrible opposite. The church avoids this passage because it reveals how far humanity can fall. It shows there is no bottom to the pit of human depravity, that in extreme circumstances, even maternal love can become corrupted. But here's the lesson no one wants to teach. This is the inevitable result of a society that rejects God. This is the natural progression of spiritual rebellion. It always ends up devouring its own children. The 10th verse of the parchment brought up the most controversial passage Marcus had ever studied, in Numbers chapter 31, verses 17 and 18. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. This is the order that makes atheists quote the Bible as an example of divine immorality. Moses orders the genocide of the Midianites, sparing only the young virgins. The modern church doesn't know how to deal with this passage. How to justify a God who orders the death of children. How to explain the selective preservation of young virgins. But here's the brutal truth they hide. God sometimes orders actions our modern morality considers unacceptable because he operates with an eternal perspective we cannot comprehend. He sees the long-term consequences of Midianite corruption. He understands how idolatrous cultures destroy future generations. This verse reveals a God willing to be misunderstood by us, to protect his greater purposes. A God who prioritizes holiness above popularity. The last verse of the parchment, the 11th, was what most disturbed Marcus. Not for its violence or shocking language, but for its brutal simplicity. It was in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 3. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. This verse closes our list with a truth that the toxic positivity church doesn't want to accept. There is a time to kill, not just metaphorically, not just spiritually, literally. Solomon, in his divine wisdom, recognizes there are moments in human history where death is not just permitted, it is necessary. Where destruction is not an evil, it is a divine tool of renewal. The modern church wants a God who is only love, only healing, only building. But biblical reality is that the same God who heals also kills. The same God who builds also tears down, and he does both at the right time, for the right reason, with the right result. After decades studying ancient manuscripts, Professor Marcus Whitfield reached a disturbing conclusion. The modern church is afraid of the Bible it claims to follow. These verses we just examined are not theological aberrations. They are windows into God's real nature. And that nature is much more complex, much more intense, much more human than we were taught to expect. Now you understand why these verses were hidden, why the church prefers to keep you on the surface, feeding you verses about love and hope, carefully avoiding these darker and more complex truths. Because these verses reveal a God who doesn't fit into our sanitized concepts of divinity, a God who feels violent jealousy, who orders violence when necessary, who uses crude language, who allows extreme suffering, who operates with a morality that transcends our understanding. These 11 verses destroy the image of the nice heavenly daddy that many churches sell. They reveal the God of the Bible in all his terrifying and wonderful complexity. The question remains, do you have the courage to worship this real God, the God who doesn't need your approval to be God, the God who sometimes acts in ways you don't understand, don't approve, and can't explain to your friends? Or do you prefer to return to the comfort of ignorance, pretending these verses don't exist, singing hymns about a God who has been domesticated to not bother anyone? The choice is yours. But if this video touched something deep in you, if it awakened a hunger for truth that goes beyond the superficial, then you need to subscribe to this channel. Because we'll keep digging, keep questioning, keep revealing the biblical truths someone decided you shouldn't know. And comment below, which of these verses shocked you most? Which changed your perspective about God? Do you have the courage to worship the real God of the Bible, or do you prefer the edited version they taught you in church? Subscribe to the channel, but only if you have the courage to know the complete truth.